Welcome to biodiversity, the tutorial about how biodiversity helps sustain an ecosystem. So first let's talk about what the word biodiversity actually means. So the first part of this word is bio. Bio meaning life, living things. So if you remember, in 6th grade we talked about things like, fungi, and protists, those crazy little things that mainly live in water that don't fit in anything else, any other category. We talked about plants, animals, and bacteria. So, anytime we're talking about biodiversity or bio, we're talking about life. You see this? Biology, the study of living things. Biodiversity, still talking about life. The second part of that word, I'm sure that you've heard multiple times, diversity. Well, I bet if you think about the classroom that you sit in, you have a diverse group of students. Students with different backgrounds, different shirt colors, different favorite colors, different food likes, different number of siblings. So diversity is something that means that there's variety, variation within the group, different individuals. So that's what that means. So biodiversity means that there's a variety or differences. So as we're talking about biodiversity, we're actually going to tie in energy in an ecosystem by talking about food chains, food webs, and energy pyramids. So the thing about biodiversity that's important to know is that the more living things you have, the more organisms you have, the more biodiversity that you have. So if you were to look at a map of the Earth, so if I were to look at the globe, so here's, let's see, I'm going to do the best I can. This is North America. There's the Gulf of Mexico. We've got South America down here. Oh, I didn't do a very good job with Mexico. That's okay. So here's North America, South America. We have the continent of Africa over here, and Europe. So this is our globe, right? Here's Europe, if you can imagine. Use your imagination on my beautiful drawing. And as you've learned in social studies, and hopefully in science, we have the equator, which is in the center. And at the equator, most of the time, the day and night are equal, so 12 hours a day, 12 hours a night. Temperature doesn't change very much, and they usually get a lot of rain. So what happens is that is the ideal climate for having a lot of organisms with a lot of variety. So the most biodiversity happens when you're on the equator. And I'm writing it where looks like it's in the water, but actually the most biodiversity is going to be in places like the rainforests in northern South America and Central America and Mexico. So right here, and all the way down into Brazil. So these rainforests are very, very diverse. I mean, we've heard them say we haven't even discovered some species that live there. So we know that rainforests are high in diversity. As you move away from the equator, diversity actually decreases. So as you move up to the poles, you're going to have the least biodiversity in the Arctic and Antarctic. So if you think about what you know about the organisms that live in these areas, there's not very many. Just thinking off the top of your head, you might think of whales, different types of whales, some krill, penguins maybe. But when we think about the rainforest that's around the equator, there's all kinds of funny things like sloths and tapir and rainforest frogs, green tree frogs and the colorful ones, and all different types of crazy plants and animals. So we know that the most variety of organisms are along the rainforests that are found in this area and also in the Congo area of Africa. So greatest biodiversity around the equator in the rainforest region. So the more organisms we have, the more diversity. So let's talk about food webs. So a food web shows how energy moves through an ecosystem. So what happens, and it also shows several paths. So energy moves from one organism to another. So for example, this grass is eaten by the rabbit. So the rabbit gets its energy from the plant. So the way that we draw the arrow is in the direction that energy flows, or to the stomach of what is eating, right? So the energy the grass makes from photosynthesis goes to the rabbit, and then maybe the rabbit is eaten by the snake, so the energy from the rabbit goes to the snake, and the snake goes to the mountain lion. Well, what I just did was I pulled out a food chain from this food web. So a food web is a group of multiple food chains. So at this point, I have 4 organisms. I have grass, and then the rabbit eats the grass, but notice my arrow goes to the rabbit because that's the way energy moves. And then that rabbit gets eaten by the snake in this particular food chain. And then that snake can get eaten by that puma or mountain lion. So what I have just pulled out is called a food chain. It's one path of energy through this food web. There's multiple paths. So another path that I could look at might be still with the rabbit but going straight to the mountain lion. Or we could look at the grasshopper eating the grass, the shrew eating the grasshopper, the shrew getting eaten by a snake, the snake getting eaten by a harp. So there's several different paths that energy flows. Now, some important words that you might need to know is that the grass, the shrubs, and the trees are all examples of producers. Producers make 100% of the energy in an energy or a food web during the process of photosynthesis. The rabbit is an herbivore, and it eats the grass. So we're going to stay with the orange arrows. So the rabbit is a primary consumer. Primary school is the first school you go to. Primary meaning first, the first consumer. Now, the other word I used to describe this rabbit was a herbivore. Herbivores eat plants. Next on the list is the snake. From primary, we move to secondary consumer. Get it? It's the second consumer. It's the second thing to eat something. Consumers must eat to gain energy. And we call this snake a carnivore, since it's only eating animals. If it were eating plants, we would call it something different. So now that we have this snake as our second level, or our secondary consumer, we go to the mountain lion. The mountain lion we could say is tertiary. So T is third, starts with T, 3 starts with T, tertiary consumer. You can have more consumers than tertiary, but we're going to only focus on up to tertiary. Again, you can call him an apex predator or a carnivore because he's eating meat. Now, as you move up this food web or this food chain, the organisms are going to use energy. So if we look at our grass, our shrubs, this is going to be using 100%, making 100% of its energy. The grass is going to use it to grow and reproduce, and it's only really going to pass about 10% of that energy to that rabbit. From that very first, that one grass plant, so if we're thinking one plant of grass passes 10% of its original energy to this rabbit from that original grass plant, that rabbit's going to use about 90% of that and store about 10%. So 10% would be passed to that snake, which 10% of 10 is 1%, and so forth. So you can see how available energy is decreasing as you go through the food chain. Now, if we were to talk about biodiversity in this food web, one good thing that we notice is that it has multiple producers. So if you were to take a producer out, let's say we remove the grass, then there would still be two other producers. So deer eat shrubs and trees, and rabbits can eat the shrubs even though they no longer have their grass. Same with the grasshopper. So the grasshopper would suffer because they've lost a source, but they would still have another one to fall back on. An ecosystem that has low biodiversity, if it just has one type of producer or fewer producers, then it's going to affect the population as you go through the food web. So having higher biodiversity helps to sustain the ecosystem because, like we said, if we took the grass out, that grasshopper and rabbit still have that shrub to eat or that tree to eat. So it's it's important to have multiple types of producers to sustain this ecosystem. So something else that you might want to be thinking about when you're looking at food webs, or you might get questions on, would be, well, what would happen to the snake population if the rabbit population was removed? And you have to think, well, the snake eats the rabbit. It can still eat a shrew, but since this is larger than a shrew and at least half of its food source, then the population is most likely going to decrease because this food source is gone. So those are some questions that we will talk about in the next couple of pictures. So we talked about food webs and how to pull a food chain out, which is one pathway through the web. Now let's look at this marine one. It's kind of weird because it's hard. We don't see a plant. So where's our producer? Well, the producer, if you notice, does not have an arrow pointing to it. So the only one that does not have an arrow pointing to it is this phytoplankton. So the phytoplankton is my one producer in this web. So if I'm doing a food chain, I'm always going to have to start with phytoplankton using this web. Then I could go straight up from cod to leopard seal to killer whale, and that could be a food chain. But the key is I have to start with the phytoplankton because it is the only producer. And I know it's the only producer because it's the only thing that does not have an arrow pointing towards it. So I just wanted to point that out using this marine web. So here's where it gets a little tricky. Sometimes we like to make things a little more difficult as teachers and to see if you truly understand. So this is a food web. The letters represent organisms, but what the organisms are doesn't really matter because we just want to focus on how energy moves through this food web. So the first thing that we're going to do is find our producer or producers. So we have to locate the letters that don't have arrows coming to them, letter or letters. So I notice right away that Z does not have any letters coming to it. So I'm going to assume that Z is a producer. And I currently do not see any others that don't have arrows coming to them. Now, I need to figure out what my primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers are. So my trick for doing that is going through each chain. So if I go through this way, Z to Y, Y would be my primary, so I write a 1. to T, T being secondary, and that ends. Now it's important to note a food chain can be just two organisms. It could be Z to Y and stop. That is perfectly fine. Shrub or forb to deer, so plant to deer would be fine. Just being one, because that deer could die of old age. That's relevant for a food chain. Or I could go from Z, to Y, Y would still be 1, to X, which would be 2, to V, which would be my 3. So if I'm looking at this purple chain, then Y is my primary, X is my secondary, and V would be my tertiary. Now here's where it gets a little funny, because if I go from Z to X, X is now my primary. And then I can go to V in this food chain, and V becomes my secondary. So both X and V can be either one type of consumer or another type of consumer. And something else that's interesting is that X eats both a producer and a consumer. So X is called an omnivore because it eats both plant and animal matter. So when you have a picture like this, all you really need to do is dissect it, work through it. If it's asking what a secondary, which ones are secondary consumers, go through and count. Producer 0 or P, 0, 1, 2. And then go through the next chain, 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 3, and make your notes on there. If you go to 1, you don't necessarily, and you've already wrote the same number, you don't have to write it down again, but it helps if you follow the webs. I'll do one more to show you. 1, 2, 3, and then right here, if we did this one, 1, 2. So hopefully that helps you understand a little bit more about how energy flows through an ecosystem. I could add, if I wanted to, I could add biodiversity to this food web. Well, if I, the teacher, want to add to it, I could create, add biodiversity by adding another producer. Maybe B goes to W. And I could add another organism maybe that eats C or T. So by adding organisms to the web, really if you have an environment with more organisms, you have more biodiversity. So what you might see is something that looks like, I don't know, this, versus something that has a lot more letters. And what you're looking for is the one that has the greatest biodiversity is the one with more organisms. So hopefully that helps with how energy moves through an ecosystem and biodiversity.